Yeah, you too, Richard. I'm really excited to be here. Been heads down for the past couple months working on stuff, so now I can finally talk about it.
Cool, cool. Yeah, maybe it'd be good to explain, first start with your background, because you have a really unique story of how you got into crypto and DeFi and got super technical and everything, from dropping out of college and all that. So yeah, maybe it'd be cool if could share that.
Yeah, love to share that. Yeah, I think the quick summary is I dropped out of college. I think that's a pretty common story nowadays. What I will say is my scenario was pretty different because of the reason I dropped out. I dropped out because I knew college wasn't going to answer some of the questions that I had for myself, which was, around like what I was going to work on, what I was going to commit fully into. And, uh, when I was in school, I was spending a lot of time going after, getting a good job out of college. And that comes with all the prerequisites, like having a high GPA, summer internships, and extracurriculars. But while I was in school, I came across Ethereum, and that was very distracting. And I started spending all my extra time I had kind of exploring what was going on there. And I just made this decision to drop out, and I didn't really have a plan. I didn't have like something I was working on. I wasn't working on primitive at the time. I really just dropped out, and I just trusted I would figure it out. And I think like how I spent the next few months was I was learning how to code. And then in 2020, before COVID like really broke out, I went to the ETH Denver conference, and I got to like meet some of the people in the community, and I just knew like right there that I wanted to contribute to the space. And so like a month after that trip, I got back home. I started Primitive with the mission to help establish this kind of alternative system that we're building, starting with the Ethereum ecosystem. And now, 3 years later, we're going to be, I think, contributing very heavily to the next stages of DeFi's overall growth. So
Mhm. Yeah,
I'm pretty excited.
one thing I find really impressive of your background is like, so, you studied business in college and like you were not technical at all. And like over
Yeah.
the period of like about a year, you like learned how to code from scratch, like picked up Solidity. And like, I'd say like you're probably like top 1% of all Solidity developers in the ecosystem, just in terms of like knowledge of the language, security, like through smart contract auditing and all that. And it's pretty impressive, like how you've like learned all of that, just like it's all self-taught without having that, like without having a CS background.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think it was just, I mean, it's kind of weird to think before I knew how to code. I don't even know what that was like. Um, but like now, some of the things that we're working on are just extremely challenging. I mean, it's actually a problem that I'm the only one on my team who can like really understand the full range of like what we're building and kind of inventing here. Um, which taps into these like very low level computer science problems, to the math, to the finance problems.
Mhm.
Um, but I've just been very focused on wanting to get this into DeFi. And then so I've just had to learn quite a lot to be able to do that myself.
Mhm. Cool. And like your first foray into like the Ethereum ecosystem was ETH Denver 2020, which I was also there. And looking back at it, like that conference was actually pretty legendary in terms of like the number of quality founders that came out of that. And it's pretty full circle that you're about to launch a primitive at like in a few weeks at this year's ETH Denver. So 3 years later, you came from like a new developer, like eager and curious about the space, to like kind of being one of the titans.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot, Richard. Yeah, ETH Denver, I just got to see like the actual people involved in building this, and I wanted to be one of them. So
yeah, yeah. And I guess we can talk a bit about, what you're working on with Primitive. Yeah, we can, get into the weeds of RMMs, but like kind of a big take I've had like over the last few years is like DeFi's kind of reached the point where a lot of the stuff coming out of DeFi is like very incremental improvements. It's like, take Aave and like add a couple of extra features on top to create this new lending protocol, or like do a copycat of Aave onto Solana or another chain. So just kind of from an investor perspective, there just haven't been very many interesting DeFi projects in the last year or two. And I think like primitives and RMMs is like one of the very few exceptions of something that's like truly 0 to 1. Like RMMs, which stands for replicating market makers, like they don't exist in traditional finance. It's this new research paper that came out a few years ago, and you're one of the first teams to implement it and like work on it. So like, why don't we start with there? Maybe just explain for everyone, like explain like on 5, what are RMMs, what are replicating market makers?
yeah, so I'm gonna tell a quick story to explain like what replicated market makers are and how we see people using them. So, and this is like a true story that I actually went through when I first got into DeFi, which was one of the first things that I think gets everyone really excited is they start seeing all these different coins that are for like different things. So there's like coins for transacting on the network. There's coins to replace the US dollar. There's coins for other products and services. And that this was this was very compelling to me. And I started buying a lot of these coins. And given my background, I was very good at spreadsheets. I still am. And I would just kind of maintain the spreadsheet every week where I'd have a column for the coin's price, the how much I had of the coin, and then kind of an objective I wanted to maintain for how much of that was actually made up, how much each coin made up of my portfolio, basically. And so every week I would go in, I'd have to update every single coin because they'd all move so erratically in price. And then I'd go in and measure like the exact trade I needed to do to get back to like the target objective I had. Then I'd go on Uniswap and I'd do all the trades, and then I go back in the spreadsheet and update them all. And so, like, long story short, how RMMs comes into play is, what I can do now with RMMs, and I do on the unreleased version, is I have this objective in mind. I can input that into RMM, and RMM is just going to automatically do everything I was doing in the spreadsheet and doing the trades. So instead of having to do all that manually, I can just let RMM take care of it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very like simple explanation of what RMM can do, but you can quickly extrapolate it beyond the individual and see this as a very powerful primitive for DeFi going forward.
Mm-hmm. So is it fair to say that like replicating market makers or RMMs, it's like a math function that gives you a desired payoff that you want? Is like, say you want some portfolio balance, then you create a math function that's given inputs will get you that portfolio balance. If you want to map the payout of a derivative, you can have a different RMM function that gets that payout. Is that a fair way to assess it?
Yeah, that's a good way to assess it with the technical language for it. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I know this is kind of speculating, but like, why don't you think RMMs exist in TradFi and traditional finance? Like, why is this something that is like uniquely new and enabled by crypto and DeFi?
So I do think a version of RMMs exists in TradFi, probably actually a better version. And this is just because in the traditional financial system, there are products and services that, like, for one, there's more powerful financial instruments that are way more efficient with capital. And then two, there's service providers who can do all that rebalancing, on my behalf as a custodian. And so the difference, for DeFi is we don't have access to the same, benefits that the traditional system does have via the legal system. And so for DeFi, we can use RMMs as a way to really verify that we're getting these financial objectives that we want without needing to rely on a custodian or an asset issuer or someone doing it on my behalf. And I think like this is the difference of why, some of these next derivative products that are going to come into DeFi are just pretty different from the traditional products that are available in the regular financial system.
Yeah, so we've been talking about like RMMs like pretty abstractly, but like maybe we can talk a bit like more about like concrete examples. So, from my understanding of this new primitive product, you're implementing an RMM that mirrors the payoff of a covered call. That's correct, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess maybe before we get into that, could you explain like what a covered call is, what a covered call strategy is? Because I know there's a lot of people who aren't like traders.
Yeah, so I think this was one challenging thing for primitive, which was RMMs is in general just a way to go from an objective into a way to actually execute that objective on chain. And where we started was with a very specific objective in mind. And this is the objective we wanted to deliver to users first and get that right, which was this covered call instrument. And covered calls we chose because they're very powerful. To summarize it quickly, if you have a covered call, you're effectively buying some underlying asset as the price of it goes down. And then you're selling it if it reaches an upper target price. And so this is very useful for traders who have a higher price target for an asset, and they're willing to pick up more of the asset as if there's any short-term declines. But at the end of the day, they really want to sell at that upper target price. And so they can use the covered call to do that and generate some extra premiums in the process. And so with RMMs, we wanted to first deliver this objective in a pre-packaged product that is very straightforward to use.
Yeah, like I've been actually selling covered calls for a long time, even before crypto. I think it's really useful when you own a lot of a certain asset. So in traditional finance, I own a lot of QQQ, which is the NASDAQ index. In crypto, I own a lot of ETH, and you want to earn yield on like your large amount of QQQ or ETH. And the covered call is a really good strategy for that because you're basically selling option premiums. And as long as the price of ETH doesn't like skyrocket to a certain price where to the strike price where the option gets exercised, you're basically earning recurring yield on the premiums, option premiums that you're selling.
Yeah, and this is actually the strategy I did when I opened my brokerage account. When I could open a brokerage account for the first time, I started trading options, and this is like what I would do. So it's pretty natural to like pick this objective for RMMs. But where we go with this is we plan to expand out the different targets that we could offer into just very easy products for people to use depending on what they need.
Yeah, and also I think covered calls like ties to another theme that's emerging in DeFi is like the concept of real yield. And Alex, you weren't here earlier. I gave a presentation on this of like yield farming and like these different growth hacks. But a lot of projects, DeFi projects nowadays have like fake yield where it's all subsidized by projects paying users with their tokens to get traction. So the concept of real yield would include things like ETH2 staking, unsubsidized borrow and lending, and LPing, and that's where covered call comes into play, because it's a way it's been used for decades in traditional finance to earn yield on assets, and it's not like subsidized by like some inorganic way.
Yeah, let's talk about that more. So I think like we had some very strong markers that DeFi has a healthy economy, which is like rooted in non-speculative demand for some of these products and services. And so like ETH2 staking, that's providing a service to improve the network's security. Lending, that is a service to provide capital so it can be borrowed. And then the third one, I think, is liquidity providing or market making, where you're providing assets so that traders can swap immediately. And I think like at the end of the day, a lot of this on-chain activity that we see, I mean, over the past like year or so, since there's been this kind of rush of speculative use, I think it's created a lot of these semi-viable mechanisms to like have these kind of transient yield products. But I think like this is just a natural part of being so early. And what Primitive is a lot more focused on is seeing where there is actually non-speculative demand for some of these instruments. And how RMMs plays into this is there is a need for a lot of these completely native businesses on chain, especially like DAOs, who do have a balance sheet and they need to manage that balance sheet. And there's a pretty limited set of tools for them to actually use right now. So I think also the last point I'd make is we have yet to see a system where almost all the participants of the network can provide these services. So like everyone can, stake ETH, everyone can provide liquidity, everyone can loan. We have yet to see the consequences of like what that creates. But my bet is that this is going to be where we start attracting more people into this alternative financial system. And for us to actually handle that size, we're going to need very strong risk management tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the DAO's point is really interesting, because you have basically all these project treasuries that are sitting on like tens of millions of dollars worth of their native tokens. And it's just really like idle tokens sitting there, and they could like be earning yield on that and like make those tokens more productive. And selling covered calls is a really obvious idea, because using the native tokens as the collateral for the underlying contracts, and then you're earning yield from them by selling calls.
Yeah, I mean, I do think all the DAOs who don't have a very large balance sheet, like they should just keep it in cash and they should focus on their business. But for the really large entities that are growing and have this like massive balance sheet, they have a few needs. They have like three needs. They have like one, they have the native token. They need to divest that native token for cash. Two, they have a balance sheet that they need to monetize. And then three, they usually need to make sure there's liquidity for their native token. And so Primitive's RMMs are just designed to solve all of those needs. And this is something we didn't really learn until we initially launched last year. And now we're a lot more focused on making sure we can build this non-speculative like base amount of demand for RMMs. And this is going to lead us into being able to grow the liquidity a lot more efficiently, and then eventually offer just more derivatives as general products for all of DeFi.
Mm-hmm. And tying it back to like RMMs, So obviously covered calls are built on top of options, the strategy based on options trading. I'm curious why in DeFi right now you can't do covered calls through the option protocols we have in DeFi. Like what's limiting for those that we need to implement covered calls through RMMs rather than just selling options?
Yeah. So Primitive started as an option protocol before we knew RMMs could even work. And I think like all of the, I mean, even if you look at today, all of the option protocols that exist now that are decentralized have one huge hurdle that none of them have been able to overcome, which is to issue those options to have them traded. They have to be backed by 100% of the collateral. And if we look at like also why some of these option protocols haven't been able to get the traction they need, I think that's also rooted in the fact most of them have been targeting this more broad DeFi consumer audience, and that audience is mostly driven not for like a need for these derivatives, but just because they want to try them. So it's more speculative use. And so RMMs answers kind of both those issues, which is creating the option instruments in the first place. What we can do with RMMs is we can get effectively the same instrument that gives us the same exposure as an option would, but we can do it with a lot less capital. And so with RMMs, you're putting up maybe 60% to 70% of the capital that an option instrument would require, but you're getting the exact same exposure you would get out of that option. And so that's what makes RMMs very different. And then just to add, since we can use RMM as a tool to get a target financial objective automatically without needing to like actively manage that position, it becomes very useful for a lot of these on-chain entities to deploy capital into it, just for that reason alone. And so this kind of gets over the second hurdle for a lot of these option protocols, which is actually building up liquidity, which is just tough to do when it's very inefficient to do that when you have to back all of the instruments that you're issuing. So yeah, we see RMMs as solving both those problems, and this is why options in DeFi are just not going to look like options. They're just going to be these new instruments, and some of them have to be invented.
Yeah, so like capital efficiency and liquidity, and you can see this in traditional finance where option markets are like the last markets to really develop in terms of having a deep order book and liquidity, just because liquidity is so fragmented across different strike prices, different maturities. So you can really only trade options for like NASDAQ, SPY, and like really the blue chips. And there isn't much liquidity for like micro cap stocks in traditional finance. And obviously in DeFi, like the problem persists with like option protocols where it's really hard to get a lot of liquidity for these option protocols. Nonetheless, like try to sell covered calls or do some option strategy on top of it. So RMMs like really solves that liquidity problem.
Yeah, I mean, to add, since most of the option protocols have targeted, this very broad, like more consumer DeFi, they're just competing as like leverage instruments, but these consumers have access to better leverage tools, which are perps. And so, option protocols and options in general is just taking a back seat to these perpetual protocols, which like do have the adoption and traction that we might have expected out of some of these other option derivative protocols. But I think that's actually a natural part of this evolution for DeFi. And next up for DeFi is when we get to more capital efficient derivatives that have these exposures that we need to actually manage the risk in a lot of our portfolios.
Yeah, there's like this old saying, it's like necessity is the mother of all inventions, and it's like kind of the liquidity scalability, capital constraints of DeFi, like forced like DeFi like engineers and researchers to like invent perpetual swaps, and then also now invent RMMs as like new financial like products.
Yeah, and that was a decision that I made with Primitive very early on, because we could have gone a route that was, creating options for DeFi that's a lot more centralized. But I purposely decided to go down this path of finding the instruments that are going to work for DeFi. And I think this year and next year, we're going to see this next stage for DeFi really blossom. So excited
Yeah.
to watch it.
Yeah, and this also ties to like one of our key thesis of like we like to invest in things that are new and like pushing the space forward rather than just like a simple copy paste from traditional finance and then put it on chain, because that's usually less exciting.
Yeah, and this we've had to invent a lot for this. I mean, even like it goes down to like even using some of the math libraries, which don't have high enough precision out to the decimal places. We have to like go and make those ourselves. And so, we keep running into a lot of these like base level infrastructure problems, and we've had to just do some risk like decision making about what we can bet is going to be solved for us and what we have to kind of build ourselves. But it's been a challenging problem for us to really deliver RMMs correctly. And so it's taken us, a full 2 years since RMMs was like officially formalized and invented to get to this point where we can ship it to like an institutional grade audience and eventually consumers.
Maybe we can get into like the weeds a little bit with RMMs, but I'm curious for you to explain like why exactly do RMMs like solve the liquidity issue with traditional options? Like what about the mechanism of like how RMMs are traded, how liquidity pools work, all that?
Yeah, to get a little technical, but without getting too lost, so derivatives derive their value from some underlying instrument and some other properties like volatility, time remaining in the instrument, and maybe some other things that are put into the instrument. And then these are all mathematically computed and what's called the Greeks. And so you can measure the efficiency of like a financial instrument by seeing the cost to get like 1 unit of a target Greek that you want to get. And so all of the option protocols, they require 100% of the collateral to get all the option Greeks that like a call option would offer. And so RMMs is basically getting those Greek exposures by replicating them. And this requires less capital. So we're just getting a more efficient use of capital for the same exact exposure. And this is why RMMs is really a new DeFi Lego that I mean, I also like want to use. So.
Yeah, it's also important to know, you talk a bit about the Greeks and, these contracts in traditional finance, but RMMs, it's not a derivative contract. So technically it's not a derivative. Like in traditional finance, if you buy a swap or an option, it's a legal contract. This promises to pay a certain amount as future date based on like X and Y market conditions. But that's not the case with RMMs, because you find some way to replicate those payoffs without having to rely on like contracts.
Yeah, and going further from that, all of the liquidity that backs these RMM as instruments is actually used as liquidity for traders to swap. And it's this utility that gives you the opportunity to actually like make way more than you expected if you can get your liquidity actually distributed to all the traders who do want to do trades through it.
Mhm.
And so this is just very different from the options that we have in the traditional financial system. And I think like this really works for DeFi a lot better than those instruments.
Mhm. So I guess practically from a user perspective, like how would they like interact with RMMs with primitive? Is it like they go to your website, they click deposit LP, like be a liquidity provider? Kind of explain through what that's like.
Yeah, so we're first focused on a more institutional audience, like DAOs or firms that operate on chain. And so getting it going from a process of finding an objective, a financial objective they have, to converting that into capital in an RMM. That's what we're building all of our tools around. And we eventually want to get to a point where for consumers, it can be the same. So they might have a target objective they want for their portfolio. That could be pretty complicated. It could be pretty simple, like the story I gave. And then they can choose that, and then they can just put their capital in an RMM, and they wait, and they don't have to do anything, and then they withdraw. And ideally, they met their objective. Maybe they even earned profits on top of it. And so that's what we're working towards this year.
Mhm. So like, I guess walking through an example of like, say myself as a user, say I own a bunch of ETH, I want to earn yield through a covered call strategy. Is it like I just deposit my ETH in a pool with the right parameters? Say this pool is going to expire in 1 week, based on like the Greeks. There's like a 5% chance it'll get exercised, it'll be in the money. And after week's over, then I withdraw my ETH, and it's like my principal plus however much yield, which comes from the trading fees that I've earned.
Yeah, that's a good walk through the process. The challenge we want to kind of alleviate is, if you have gaps in understanding the product, can that be, can we reduce the friction for many users who do have a very clear objective in mind, but they don't really know, what's going on in the background. And so, making the tools that actually uh, solve that friction for them is part of like our challenge and focus on getting the user experience really frictionless, and the
Mhm.
developer experience too.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess one challenge with like covered calls is like you do have to be kind of sophisticated to like know like your covered call trading strategies. Like you have to know like what expiries to choose. Like should you do weekly or monthly? Also have a familiarity with the Greeks, like delta,
Yeah,
like basically percentage that like you're profitable, percentage in the money. But at Primitive, you're gonna try to abstract all of that away.
yeah, we want to be very careful about what we abstract away, and a lot of the language I'm using even now, like talking, is very precise on purpose, because we don't want to like hide what's going on with RMMs. Like we want it to be as transparent as possible. What we do want to make easier is, going from a very general goal to, getting the tool that's going to accomplish it for you. And so I think we'll have different levels of abstraction, but we're more focused on precisely getting what every user wants, and them understanding both that process and the outcome really well.
So you'll have like a managed pool where kind of I remember in like the V1 you had like the highlighted pool, right? So and that takes care of like selecting all the parameters.
Yeah, we're coming up with I mean, the tools that we're going to be launching are going to be making it very easy for anyone to go from objective to deploying capital. But what that looks like, we haven't decided on yet, because we're going to be focusing on getting these first customers who really have a need for RMMs. And once we reach that point, we can focus on making this tool more accessible to everyone who's using DeFi, especially the easier DeFi products like Uniswap, like some of the dashboards or some of the more basic tools.
Yeah, or like something like Yearn, right? Yearn, if you
Yeah,
haven't used it, it's it's a yield aggregator where you have all these different vaults and different yield strategies, and you can deposit, USDC or ETH or other assets into like each of these vaults and earn yield based on whatever strategies they're running.
yeah. For us, making these tools very clear on what's going on without complicating it. This has been kind of the main challenge that we've been working on for quite a lot of time now. So we are getting to the point where we really understand RMMs good enough to balance the right amount of abstraction and help for all the users who want to try it out.
Mm-hmm. Are you ready yet for a product demo, or is it like the front end is still like a work in progress?
Yeah, so we don't have a product demo ready. We were slated to launch the protocol in March to definitely mainnet and probably a few more networks. And then quickly after we launch the protocol, we're going to be following it with an institutional grade product. So if you're we're happy to discuss with anyone if anyone wants to try it out a little early, but we're really focused on getting this to the customers who really actually have like a non-speculative need for it. And then from there, we can go and make it more accessible to the broader DeFi community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you need a couple of whales to like bootstrap all the pools.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the DAOs who operate their businesses on chain, they need a tool like this, and if they can start with the initial liquidity in the system, this is going to be the best way to grow the ecosystem from there.
Mm-hmm. Could you share some of the DAOs you're working with, or that's still kind of a secret for now?
Yeah, that'll be I'm going to keep that close for now. But we really like the DAOs that, I mean, it makes more sense for the larger DAOs who have a huge balance sheet, but we're pretty open to talking with, if not all of them.
Mm-hmm. Cool, cool. Well, we're a little early. I guess is there anything else you got that you wanted to chat about? I guess, well, what's new and exciting to you in DeFi other than RMMs?
Yeah, I have been I've been very focused on getting RMMs to be shipped. I think it comes at cost of not looking at exactly everything that's going on in DeFi. I think the high level at a high level, like we're seeing some very key pieces of DeFi really work well in like the most volatile situations. I think it's like definitely a good sign that when the markets are extremely erratic, that lending protocols like Compound and Aave can work like flawlessly because they have a spot market like Uniswap to pick up their volume from liquidations. And I think like if we look at the next stage of DeFi where it grows to be quite a massive size, then RMMs is the perfect thing to manage a lot of the risk that we don't have existing tools to handle so far.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but other than that, I haven't focused too much on every individual product
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
been launched.
yeah. Well, like I said at the beginning, it's like from my perspective and like seeing a lot of different like new DeFi projects, it's very hard to like find new stuff that's like really 0 to 1 or groundbreaking, and like like, yeah, RMMs are very refreshing because it's actually a new like primitive that is just invented pretty recently and doesn't exist in traditional finance.
Yeah, that reminds me of like one interesting observation, which is uh, there's there's a lot of really successful projects that use like arguably inferior designs. Like one example being a lot of the Uniswap v2 forks. And how we see this is that I mean, there's also a lot of projects that build on like Uniswap v3, but one of the things that we see is like the systems that are really easy to build on and have a really strong developer experience really grow a lot faster than the more complicated ones like Uniswap v3. And there's even devs that are willing to like overcome those hurdles. But what we are also focusing on with our next launch is making RMMs a tool that's like really easy to build around. And we're gonna be launching most of it as completely open source code that can be forked, and we'll probably say like, yeah, please go and fork it and try it yourself. And this is going to be how we really build up a pretty large developer ecosystem, which is like one of the more compelling reasons of why I got into Ethereum, because I think like 1 million developers, that's a lot of developers.
Yeah. And actually, a fun fact, there was actually another project. It was like these two Stanford grads that were building decentralized option vaults, or like similar to decentralized option vaults on top of primitive. They pivoted to building a data platform, but that's an example of developers that can build on top of like the RMM primitives.
Yeah, we got a lot of inbound when we launched the protocol last year, and we did have a lot of friction with kind of explaining how to properly use the system and build around it. And so with our next launch, we kind of preempted a lot of that, and so we have a lot of tooling and documentation to just make it really easy for even like very young developers to go and try and be creative with the tools we made, because RMMs is a very general framework for just accomplishing financial objectives automatically, in while maintaining all of the ethos of decentralized finance.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, looking forward to your launch at ETH Denver.
Yeah, we'll be announcing it probably towards the end of ETH Denver, so look out for it then.
Great. Great. Well, thanks, Alex. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, this was great. Happy to talk anytime.